Hello, hello. This is Atilla Yesilada reaching out to you from Istanbul once again. My last couple of videos were about Turkish politics and economy. Turkey's political crises will continue for the next 3 years to go. So really, there isn't much new to say at this point. So I'm going to turn my laser sharp focus to Turkish foreign policy. And I'm going to answer a question that's asked more frequently, both in Israel and in Turkey. Are these two countries going to war over Syria? I have done videos about Turkey and Israel in the past, where perennial frenemies, sometimes were friends, sometimes were enemies. But for the life of me, I honestly never thought I would seriously even consider the question of these two countries coming to blows. Simply, they were geographically too far away from each other. And even though they disagreed on the cause of Palestine, there wasn't really a significant differences of opinion about, economic integration, tourism, or even despite Erdogan's denials, what's good for the region. For instance, Turkey is presumably an ally of Iran. In reality, we're not. We're polite competitors. And to the extent Israel undermines Iranian military and the economy, Turkey is comfortable and cool with that. Now, the regime change in Syria has changed this balance. The two countries have come very close in geographical proximity. Israel has expanded its invasion of Golan Heights to the neighboring areas and declared itself the protector of the Druze minority. And Druze seem happy with that. As well, Syria essentially declared south of Damascus, all the way to Golan Heights, a non-military zone, meaning that any Syrian military movement or a military movement by allies of current Syrian regime, i.e. Turkey, would be casus belli. That is, they can be bombed. On the other hand, Turkey has not expanded its physical control over Syria, but Ankara and the new government in Damascus, al-Shara government or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham government, are very close allies. Turkey is sort of the Sherpa of the new Syrian government to find its ways in international circles. Also, clearly, Turkey wants to make sure that the Syrian Kurdish autonomous region, undeclared autonomous region, to the east of Euphrates be dismantled or face the threat of yet another Turkish campaign to dismantle it by force. Finally, I think that's what really angered Israel. Turkey offered Damascus to train its army and, in fact, to take over one or two air bases to help Syria control its skies. Now, this has angered Israelis further and alarmed them simply because when the current Palestine crisis started, Turkey began working actively against Israeli interests. Not only has Erdogan led the Muslim resistance to the slaughter in Gaza, Turkey also helps Hamas, and Turkey is one of the plaintiffs in the current court case to declare Israel government a war criminal. Turkey also imposed an embargo or sanctions on Turkish exports to Israel, but that was a joke. We still export to Israel as much as we did, probably even more, but they're being invoiced through either Azerbaijan or Greece, Bulgaria, whatever. It doesn't make a difference. Trade is fungible. Okay. So there was already antagonism, but it reached beyond the disagreement over the cause of Palestine. There was a report commissioned by the Israeli government called the Nagel Report, which urged the Israeli government to consider hot clashes or a military confrontation with Turkey because of Turkey's quote unquote neo-Ottomanism and expansionism. In return, influential policy circles in Turkey, including the government, but also left-wing intellectuals, start claiming that Israel's objective is to build a huge buffer zone in Iraq and Syria using the Kurdish citizens of these two countries. And in fact, at the very end, Israelis' expansionist aims have put Anatolia in the bullseye. How serious are these claims? I really don't know. But, perception is reality. And as it stands, there are many reasons, not only in Syria, but also in philosophy and in the strategic doctrines of these two countries that cause them to oppose each other. And when, as I've said, geographical proximity increased, we really need to talk about the potential for Israel and Turkey war. I think a full-out war is still impossible. I think both countries recognize this is going to be a war of attrition with no end, just sapping economic resources and human power. Consider Israeli strengths in military. Israel has a small but war-tested land force, an air force that's superior to Turkey's F-16 fleet, has a wide range of attack missiles, and great intelligence, the kind of intelligence that Turkey or even the United States are envious of. But in return, Turkey has a huge land army, also well motivated and very patriotic, and also used to irregular warfare. Turkey has superior armed drone systems to Israel, and we have seen what Turkish drones or Turkish drone war doctrine have achieved in Ukraine against Russia, and prior to that in Caucasus when Azerbaijan reclaimed the renegade province of Nagorno-Karabakh. Moreover, as the final disadvantage of Israel, if a war were to take place, it's going to take place in Syria, which is hostile ground for Israeli forces. Not all Israelis love Turkey. Not all is, I'm sorry, my apologies. Not all Syrians like Turkey. Not all Syrians are fundamentalists, or at least they don't subscribe to the view of political Islam that unites al-Shara government and Erdogan's governments. But there is one thing that's certain. Most Israelis, at least the majority Sunni Arabs, don't want Israel on their territory. So again, I don't want to take sides. in case of a war. I don't want to sound jingoistic. I think if a war were to take place, it's going to destroy the economic resources of both countries. This is why, even though the issue crops up regularly, which is Turkey and Greece going to war over Aegean Islands, I just don't take that stuff too seriously. Nowadays, wars are very expensive, and Israel is paying for that. Turkey too. I mean, look, okay, our total GDP is, I think, larger than Israel or similar, but you know, keeping hundreds of thousands of men and women under arms, feeding them, sending them hundreds of miles into Syria is a devastating burden on Turkey's already overstretched budget. So why am I shooting this video? Simply because A, there could be unexpected accidents or unwanted consequences, black swan events that may force both nations to declare war upon each other. Two, both countries are actively lobbying Trump to take sides in Syria between Turkey and Israel. Three, Turkey doesn't care much about Israel. I don't think anyone in Turkey seriously thinks we're ever going to attack Israel. But Syria is important to us. It's not only important because we want the Syrian Kurds to be fully integrated into a central government, but also because there are huge economic windfalls to be made if and when Syria receives enough international donations to rebuild its shattered economy. So neither side is going to give up on Syria. What kind of accidents, you might wonder, which may suddenly trigger a flare-up in the military conflict? Well, Middle East Eye, a reliable source about Middle East politics, reported that Turkey and the Syrian government had agreed for Turkey to take over an airbase called T4. I'm sorry, S4, T4, S4, whatever. And that this is one of the air bases that Israel has bombed. A reliable Turkish expert, Rusen Çakır, claimed in his podcast that there were already Turkish construction workers, even perhaps Turkish military advisors, on the base grounds, which may have been killed. Now, Ankara played it cool, didn't really object too much, and said, in fact, you know, we don't want to, face a clash with Israel in Syria. If the Syrian government wants to reach different deals with Israel, we would welcome that. But this is not really very genuine. I think Ankara is simply saying these things because Erdogan doesn't want to anger Trump. So these are the kind of accidents that are going to proliferate. Proliferate because no matter what Israel says, Turkey is going to send labor, machinery, equipment, and advisors to Syria for rebuilding purposes. It's quite possible that at some time in the future, when the Syrian Kurds really join the national army, the task of policing or defending the ISIS prison camp and the ISIS relatives' sprawling refugee camp will be coordinated between Turkey and Syria, which means Turkish military will be on the ground. Also, I mean, obviously, to the extent there's funding available, you're going to see Turkish companies operating on Syrian ground. And how would Israel know whether these companies are building civilian infrastructure or military ones, which may eventually be used against Israel? So that's, to me, the biggest scare, that for some reason Israel will bomb Turkish assets on Syrian soil, and at some point, Turkey will have to react. Two, as I've said, Israel philosophically, for reasons I don't quite understand, envisions a weak and decentralized Syria. Turkey wants exactly the opposite. We want a governmental structure in Syria which closely emulates Turkey, which means a very strong central administration with a strong president. Now, both sides obviously have, their arguments have merits. There is no doubt about it. But it's inconceivable for Turkey to live with a federal Syria because it would involve a Syrian Kurdish autonomous entity, which is reason for war for Turkey. Turkey will do everything to fight against that. Three, I understand why Israel might want a weak Syria, but a weak Syria is also a poor Syria. Honestly, in the comments, push back, but the only way Syria can undertake the massive cost of reconstruction, estimated anywhere between $250 billion to $450 billion, is to have a single voice in Damascus, which has full control over the entire country and can sign binding and enforceable contracts with third parties. Now look at Iraq. United States divided Iraq into three regions, three administrative entities, the Kurdish Autonomous Region, and then power sharing between the majority Shia and the minority Sunni. And we know where that led. Iraq is rife with corruption and it can't make any significant investment decisions. Simply, Kurds, Sunni Arabs, and Shia Arabs want their share. A repetition of this in Syria, which doesn't have the oil to export, at least at this point, means that the country will be impoverished forever. Syrian refugees will never return to Syria from Turkey, and Turkey will not make the mucho bucks from rebuilding of Syria. So this is a conflict that's going to get worse. Both sides are actively lobbying White House. Israel wants Trump to keep American soldiers on the Syrian grounds and to plump down for a weak Syria argument. Turkey wants exactly opposite. Now, Trump, if I understand his thinking correctly, apparently likes Israel more than Turkey. But then again, he does get along very well with the Turkish President Erdogan. And he doesn't want to be involved in foreign wars. So how Trump will decide is going to matter greatly. And I don't know the timing of Trump making that decision. As you might have observed, his hands are quite full with other matters. In the bad case scenario of Trump keeping American soldiers in Syria and advising the Damascus government that a federalist structure which makes room for a Syrian Kurdish autonomous region could possibly end the friendly relationship between Erdogan and Trump. And at a time when Trump's friendship is very precious, losing an ally like Trump would cost Turkey greatly. I mean, we could be subject to additional tariffs, punitive tariffs by the Trump administration. Trump could post humiliating messages to Truth Social to urge Turkey to stop from campaigning in northeast Syria or to pull Turkish soldiers from other cantons Turkey currently occupies at her border. This is a very scary possibility. As I've told you several times, foreign investors are already pulling out, and they could pull out the remainder of their money. Turkey could have difficulty rolling over its maturing loans if Trump openly turns against Turkey. So, this means a prolonged low-level conflict between Turkey and Israel with no clear winners. Can this change? Yes, obviously. Trump saying, look, I like you both. I want you to sit down in a room, perhaps even, organize something like Camp David, bringing together Netanyahu and Erdogan and telling them you're not leaving the grounds of Camp David until you work out your differences and an entente is achieved. But I think it's more important that there's some kind of peace or resolution in Gaza. If the war or the slaughter, call it, I want to call it other names, but nowadays YouTube has become a very polite place. I don't care about demonetization. I don't want my channel to be shut off. So I'm just not going to use the Gen word, but it is what it is. Uh, Once that ends, I think Turkey and Israel can reach an agreement on how to divide their spheres of influence in Syria. That is the second good case scenario. The final good case scenario is uh, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Arab countries, which have more or less friendly relations with Israel, sort of guaranteeing that Turkey will not turn Syria into a protectorate and mobilize or incentivize the Syrian governments to prepare to attack Israel. If you ask me which way this is going to go, I would say for the next year or so, the potential for clashes is very high. Oh, there is one final factor. It may be not in the best interests of Mr. Erdogan to reach an agreement with Israel on Syria. To a lesser extent, this is also true for Netanyahu. For Netanyahu, at least Turkish press sources claim that he needs to continue this war. First Gaza, then Lebanon, then Iran, then Syria, simply because if the war ends, he's going to face prison terms. I don't know. That's at least what the Turkish press says. For Erdogan, having a new external enemy, which always unites the conservative nationalist vote behind a strong leader like him, is actually of advantageous. Finally, I'm really sorry. This always happens. I get overexcited. I care passionately about what I do. Uh, Erdogan has started a political crisis and wants to completely eliminate the opposition. But that doesn't solve his problem that constitutionally he's a lame duck. He needs to find a way to make himself electable again. I don't want to go over the arguments that I've expressed in my previous videos. You can check them. But there's a very neat way, which is in 2000, to continue the current conflict with Israel, even escalated just to the point of military clashes, but not quite there. And then in 2027, declare war on Israel. Then the Turkish Grand Assembly can vote to defer presidential and general elections at least for a year. It can defer elections indefinitely if there is a state of war. So again, this is conspiratorial. We're not there. I'm talking about hypotheticals upon hypotheticals. But if the current Turkish-Israeli conflict reaches 2027, Erdogan might say, we're declaring war on Israel, with the understanding that, of course, there would never be a war, but it's the declaration of war that allows the Turkish parliament to defer Turkish elections. Well, this has been another video by Real Turkey channel, presented by Atilla Yesilada. You know the drill, subscribe, share, push the like button, whatsoever. Uh, I love your comments. I read them all, believe me, and they really entertain me and they educate me. But it has been so busy, I have not been able to write replies. But as soon as things calm down a tad bit in Turkey, I'll get back to it. I hope to see you in my next video and have a good day.